You're listening to Everybody Pulls the Tarp, the go-to podcast for high performers. I'm Andrew Moses. Each week, you'll hear my thought-provoking conversations with Olympians, pro athletes, CEOs, elite coaches, best-selling authors, and other high performers to uncover their secrets to success. Get ready to be inspired each week when we talk about leadership, teamwork, work ethic, and more. Are you ready? Let's go. Hi, everyone. This week, my guest is Jeffrey Douville. Jeff is a global supply chain and logistics executive with over 35 years of experience leading logistics teams in the U.S. Army and various commercial industries. Today, Jeff is the director of global logistics for Stanley Black Decker. The company has more than 60,000 employees, over $15 billion in revenue, and is the largest tool company in the world. Jeff joined the company in February 2020 to lead global logistics just as the COVID-19 pandemic started wreaking havoc on supply chains all over the world. In our conversation, we explored Jeff's career in the U.S. Army and what he learned about leadership, teamwork, productivity, and commitment to a greater purpose. We also discussed his transition from the military to the private sector and his experience leading a complex global business through some of the most challenging times in history. The conversation you are about to hear is a bit different than my typical podcasts. This episode was recorded live on Zoom at a virtual event for Penn State University's Smeal College of Business. It's the second live show I've recorded. The first was with Olympian and two-time World Cup champion Ali Krieger back in October 2020. It's a ton of fun to record the podcast with a live audience, and I look forward to being part of more events like this in the future. If you are interested in hosting a live or virtual Everybody Pulls the Tarp show for your team or organization, send me an email at andrew@everybodypullsthetarp.com, and we can make it happen. I learned a ton from the conversation with Jeff, and I know you will too. So let's pull the tarp and get straight to Jeff Douville. Jeffrey, where I want to begin, I want to start first thanking you for your military service. That's such an important piece of your story. And I really want to begin there. What drew you to serve in the U.S. Army? Talk about that for a little bit to get us started.
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was part of a blue-collar family. Mother, father both worked, 5 kids. It's typical kind of Midwest blue-collar family, Catholic education. I had an uncle, my dad's brother that served in the military. He was a career Army officer. And even though I wasn't, I really appreciated his service. I appreciated his attributes and what the Army did for him over the course of his lifetime. I really didn't intend to go that way. And it's interesting how sometimes luck, sometimes just listening to the right advice at the right time kind of sends you in a path that really benefits you and your family and things like that. And that's exactly what happened. I was working part-time while I was going to college, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and was working part-time in a racquetball club. And there was a recruiter that stopped me in the locker room and said, "Hey, you're going to school. You're an athlete. You like to play sports. We got a deal for you." And it was about joining the reserves while I was in college and then becoming an Army officer. So, again, it was a happenstance kind of event. I thought about it for just a couple of days and boom, that was it. And then I was, kind of going on that path to be an Army officer once I graduated college.
So what were the initial weeks and months like for you once you had made that decision?
Excitement. It took a real load off my shoulders, actually, because I knew what I was going to do right out of college. I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to, go through that stress that most, college students go through, in their junior and senior year that says, now I got to go and interview and I don't know where I'm going to work. And there's all that kind of excitement, but also stress. And I didn't have that. I knew what I was going to do. And I was locked in. From that point on, it actually helped me actually be a better student because, I just locked in. A few months later, a couple of months later, this is probably in the February timeframe of that year of my freshman year. So in the summer of between my freshman and sophomore year, I went to basic training, just like all enlisted soldiers go through at the front end of their commitment. So I went to basic training in Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And growing up in Milwaukee, fairly homogeneous city, especially back in the 60s and 70s. But there was the first time that I was exposed to diversity on an hourly and daily basis. Blacks, Hispanics, all parts of the country. And it was just, it was exciting for me. It was interesting, exciting, and it was just opened up my mind in terms of the strength that we believe our strength, and that's diversity. So it was awesome. It was a great summer.
Once you get into the military service a little bit, what are some of the biggest kind of initial learning experiences for you? You talked about the diversity as something that really stood out, but what about some of the initial learning experiences and takeaways for you professionally?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, nobody asks you where you grew up, what your parents do, what college or university you went to. Everybody starts out on an even platform, and it's all about what you bring to the team, what you bring to the table. It has nothing to do with any of that other stuff that maybe even in some cultures that's important, but especially in the Army, it's about what do you deliver to this team today, and that's the respect that you're gonna earn and you're gonna have with your peers. So it was kind of that. I didn't have to talk about that. I didn't have to talk about where I came from. I didn't have to talk about what my parents did. It might come up. It might be interesting conversation, but in terms of having an opportunity to excel, in this Army enterprise, it was all about what you bring to the table. And a lot of it has to do with attitude.
We're going to talk more about attitude and some of these leadership philosophies that you developed over time, both in the military and in your professional career. Jeff, I'm curious, a lot of positives there. Was there something in particular, at the beginning in those early years that you found to be a significant challenge, something that really stood out in that sense?
Well, it kind of goes back to the ROTC program while I was in college. Once I went to basic training, came back out, went right into ROTC, was in the reserves at the same time. And there was a cadre, between the cadre and my fellow cadets in the ROTC program, I learned about standards. I learned about attention to detail. I learned about shared success and shared sacrifice. That was all going through college. So when I got to the military, I kind of understood what it would take to be effective in an Army environment. And so when I got in there, it was just now about learning my functional area, which was logistics. I went in as a logistics officer. It was good because I came, out of my business program, went right into logistics. So that was the first part of my Army experience, was really going and getting trained on how to be the technical aspects of being a logistics officer in the Army. And then immediately went overseas, immediately went to Korea. And at that time, in the mid 80s, Korea was just transitioning from really a military-led government into civilian leadership. There was a transition happening. And, many don't know, but North Korea and the Republic of Korea are technically still at war. They signed a ceasefire in 1953, but there was no peace declaration, or still isn't today. So it was really, in the mid 80s, it was a real tense environment. And so my first assignment in the Army was overseas, really within long-range artillery distance of the North Koreans. And the sense of urgency, the sense of purpose, the sense of mission, the reliance on each other as a team, because you never knew, when bad things would happen there. So that was kind of that first, as a young professional, a young leader, to get that experience was just awesome.
Was that the moment that you said, I really want to be a leader? I want to lead people. I want to embrace these philosophies and kind of dedicate yourself to that? Or was there another moment, or maybe a combination of moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is what's great about whether it's the military academy or ROTC programs. By the way, ROTC produces about 70% of Army officers. The academy, another 20%, and then another 10% come in through the enlisted ranks, and they go through officer candidate school. But really, while I was in school, going through the ROTC program and learning about leadership, I remember one of my first ROTC classes was about leadership. And they were talking about theory X and theory Y management. And I was thinking, it really intrigued me to learn about management theory and to understand, what it takes to be an effective leader and certain styles of leadership that might be more effective in certain environments and others that might be more effective in another environment. So all of that really energized me. It got me excited about being a leader in general, and then being in the military and the education that the Army provides you in terms of leadership was amazing.
Jeff, I've asked, tons of guests on the podcast the question about whether, people are born great leaders, or do they develop leadership skills over time, or both? And the same thing around work ethic. Are people born with great work ethic? Do they develop great work ethic over time? When you think about that question, both sides of that, leadership and work ethic, through your lens, were these things that you felt like you were naturally gifted with, or were things that you really had to develop from that point forward once you kind of dedicated yourself to it?
Yeah, there's certain attributes, I believe, that really allow you to be maybe more effective in certain situations. But generally, it's about desire, it's about commitment, it's about passion to do whatever you want, whether it's being a leader or being a technical expert. So I think it's more that, but there are certain attributes, I believe. I mentioned I grew up in Milwaukee and went to a Catholic grade school. And besides growing up in a family environment that was really authentic, that was really focused on family and helping people, the Catholic education in terms of developing a conscience, developing right and wrong, feeling bad when you did something wrong, feeling really proud when you did something right, that all helped. That helped build this foundation, as a young kid that stayed with me my whole life. And then, when you go into the Army, which is a values-based institution, we had these Army values of loyalty and duty and respect and honor and selfless service and integrity, personal courage. And you get measured by that. You get measured by those values and how you demonstrate those values. You'd get a annual evaluation report. On the front side was all about, those values, and you'd have to call out how you demonstrated those values. And the backside of that report was about performance and about potential. And that's why, companies today, when you look at, the real strong companies have a value set that they measure their leaders by.
Jeff, I'm curious, as you kind of developed as a leader, what was it like going from leading maybe small teams to larger teams? How did you adapt and navigate through that?
Yeah, the first thing is about leading yourself. You got to know how to lead yourself. And there's certain attributes, you mentioned some attributes that make you more of an effective leader. But that's the first thing. You got to lead yourself. And then the Army, probably earlier than most companies, I would say, put you in charge, put you in a leadership role where you have an impact on a lot of people. Like right away out of college, you become a platoon leader. You might have 40 people under your leadership responsibility. You're just a young professional. You only got 6 months, 12 months out of college, and you've got all of this leadership responsibility. And that's why you got to rely on the seasoned people in the organization. The Army, one of the strengths of the U.S. Army and the U.S. military in general is our non-commissioned officer corps, our enlisted soldiers that go up the enlisted track, become team leaders, become supervisors, become, senior supervisors. They provide essentially, they're the keeper of the standards. We call them the backbone of the Army, because young officers come in and they have to listen, they have to learn from these experienced enlisted personnel and trust them, and they have to trust you, and you learn all of that.
What were some of the things that you did in particular to try and tap into that reservoir of knowledge and learn from as many people as you could?
Well, the first thing is an officer generally comes in, most officers aspire to be a commander. They aspire to be a commander. And the first command opportunity, but we'll take platoon leader out of it. You could call that a platoon commander, but the first real command opportunity is when you're a captain. So you got about 7 years in, and you now have responsibility for a group anywhere from 80 to 500 people. You've got different sections or different sub organizations within that command structure. And you get that fairly early as a professional. And I remember going to my battalion headquarters as a young lieutenant. I saw a poster. It was called "So You Want a Command." So You Want a Command. It's by Bruce Clark, General Bruce Clark, from one of our previous generation generals, World War II era general. And it was a series of questions. Basically, it says, do you just want this leadership position to put it on your resume? Or do you really want to be a leader? Do you really want to be a commander? There's a series of questions in this thing that talks about sacrifice, that talks about, in some cases, the loss of balance that you'll have to accept. There's questions in there about, are you ready to still commit to a standard of excellence in performance, even though you might not have all of the resources necessary to, that you would like to have to drive that organization to success. So it was reading that poster, and then, I created my little book, So You Want a Command book. And, while I was a paratrooper at Fort Bragg after I got back from Korea, oftentimes when you would get shooted up, you'd have about 15 to 30 minutes waiting before you load the aircraft to get on the aircraft. And, it's a period of introspection. You're doing a lot of reflecting before you get on this, this airborne operation where, in the middle of the night, a lot of dynamics. So I would write notes about things that I saw or things that I was thinking about that would make me a better commander eventually in a few years. So I kept this book and wrote all these things down. But that was the first part of aspiring, really is reflecting and being sure that that's what I wanted to do, and to be sure that I had what it took to be an effective leader, because you're charged with the responsibility of all these people. And it's just not only on duty time, it's off duty. This is what's a little bit different than military in the civilian world.
It's interesting, Jeff. I mean, one of the things that's been so consistent through all the conversations I've had with people who are successful and come from all walks of life in every industry that you could imagine is their hard work is often rooted in passion, and they enjoy the journey as much as they like the outcome, or as much as they seek the outcome, right? They like recording music equally, if not more, than they enjoy having a platinum record, right? And the same thing with people in sports, basketball players who enjoy practicing 1,000 free throws as much, if not more, as they enjoy the games when the arenas are filled with crowds. It's interesting. I mean, when I hear you talk there, about, so you want a command, you have to be passionate about it. It can't just be something you want this role for the sake of having this role. I think there are some parallels there.
Yeah. And, and this is where being honest with yourself is really important, is especially if you aspire to be in world-class organizations. In the Army, Army was generally a very high standards enterprise, but you had these special organizations that were even a cut above those. In the 82nd Airborne Division, we kind of prided ourselves in having really high standards. And so I remember, I watched Nick Saban was interviewed by 60 Minutes, I think in 2014. First time 60 Minutes went into an university out, and I'm a Penn State fan. I just want to make that clear. But Nick Saban, so 60 Minutes went in there, first time in an Alabama practice. Nick Saban, I think he was just there maybe a year or two. They just came off a BCS championship, I think in 13. So they went into the practice facility, and all of a sudden they see Nick Saban bolting across the practice field at this freshman receiver, barking at him because he didn't run his route precisely. And the guy at 60 Minutes said, "Nick, what are you doing? The kid just got here. He was just on campus for about 3 weeks now, and you're all over him." He said, "Yeah, but you don't understand. I got to understand if this guy's going to have the standards of excellence, because mediocrity doesn't go well with high achievers, and high achievers don't blend well with people with a standard of mediocrity." So it's really about, again, kind of reflecting and really being honest with yourself to say, do I really fit these? I want to be with a world-class organization. I want to be with an organization that's high standards, but I got to bring it every single hour of every day. Otherwise, I'm not going to fit in.
Jeff, and speaking of world-class organizations, I want to transition in a couple minutes to talk about some of the work you're doing at Stanley Black Decker, a world-class organization, a Fortune 500 company. But I want to dive first into a little bit about communication and chain of command and things like that. One of the things anybody I talk to who has any military service, they say communication is one of the things that you learn as effectively in the military as you might anywhere else. And I'm curious how you learned to communicate effectively as a leader, as a colleague, and maybe how that's continued to help you professionally and personally.
Yeah, and it's interesting. People think that in a military environment, it's very top-driven, orders and giving orders and receiving orders and following orders and all this stuff, when in fact it's the opposite. And this gets into your question about communication. There's a term we use called mission type orders. It actually came from the Prussian military, the Germans, Prussian military back in the 1800s. It's called Auftrag Tactics, I think, is the German word. My wife, who's Italian, she's going to correct me here, later on. But anyhow, what it means is mission type orders. And the Prussians learned this from Napoleon in the early 1800s, when Napoleon, even though he had all conscripts within his forces, he beat the heck out of the Prussians. And it made him reflect, it made him think about, what are we doing wrong? And it was all about the agility and the flexibility of Napoleon's forces based on these mission type orders. And mission type orders is really, you might have heard commander's intent. Commander's intent is given a clear mission, given a clear purpose of what we're going to tackle, given key tasks associated with that mission, not in prescriptive terms, but in descriptive terms, given clear end state objectives, and then aligning on the risks associated with that particular initiative or event. And that is absolutely key if you want to empower your workforce, if you want to have that flexibility and agility, especially today. We live in this VUCA environment, this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. Things are popping up more, every day and every week that goes by. There's something else that's popping up that was unforecasted that you've got to have the agility and flexibility to negotiate, navigate through. So it starts with commander's intent. And then it's just a matter, there's something that we use in the military. We call it a brief back, a commander's brief back. And then there's a back brief. A brief back is because, in these different environments, you got a lot of people that are tired, hungry, haven't slept. Their mind might be wandering. So the brief back is, tell me what I just said, just to make sure that we're aligned, leader led, that we're aligned on what the mission is and what the priorities are in the ask. And then there's a commander's back brief that says, okay, come back to me in a day or two and tell me how your organization is going to nest within the higher level operation order or operations plan. So that's another, yeah.
No, Jeff, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I'm just, really, it's just fascinating to me. I can't even imagine, especially kind of with the modern communication and email and text and all these things, how many directions to colleagues and people who work for different leaders get kind of misinterpreted. And then without that brief back that you talk about, like you could go on for days, weeks, months, years without knowing how well aligned the actions that you're taking are with the intent.
Right. And that commander's intent, generally it's specific to initiatives or projects or events and that. But really it starts with your command philosophy. And it starts with, and then it includes some guiding principles. So in the absence of any instructions or any directives coming from higher, if you understand what your leader's philosophy is, leadership philosophy, command philosophy, if you understand what the guiding principles are, then go out and do great things. And making mistakes is part of learning. Obviously you want to protect your team from making crucial mistakes, and you'll be a little bit more, hands-on in those cases. But for the most part, it's about empowerment, decentralized execution, good collaboration across the team. But I think it's that leadership philosophy or command philosophy and guiding principles that allows them, in the absence of direction, to still march towards that vision, those end state objectives that you set up.
For our live audience, I see a couple questions coming in the chat, which we will get to. Keep your questions coming in the chat. We'll get to a few in a couple of minutes. Jeff, that's a great segue. I mean, you talked about empowerment and working together. This show is called Everybody Pulls the Tarp, and it's all based upon a philosophy that I have that great teams, great organizations, great communities are powered by individuals who do the unexpected. They step up and contribute in whatever way is necessary, regardless of what their job description says, what their title is, or anything like that. And, you've heard the story before. Many of my listeners have heard the story a few times. But for me, it all goes back to an internship I had in minor league baseball. I think I'm there to learn the business of sports. The first day, the general manager tells me and the other interns to keep some old clothes in the locker room, that we would be helping the grounds crew run the tarp on and off the field when it rains. And we did it that summer 15, 16, 17 times. And when I started to ask why, what I learned was the major league team has the same size field, the same dirt, the same grass as we had in the minor leagues. The difference was we didn't have the personnel. We had a grounds crew that maybe was half or a third the size of what the major league crew had. And we didn't have the resources. So everybody, CEO, CFO, chief marketing officer, and all the interns would pitch in to help that grounds crew get the tarp on and off the field. And while you're doing it, what you realize is something that you take for granted. Me as a baseball fan for years, I saw many tarps pulled on and off the field, but what you don't realize until you get into it, it requires a lot of coordination, a lot of communication. You're under a lot of pressure. It's raining. In a lot of instances, the crowd is watching. Maybe they're booing. I remember one instance they were booing because we couldn't get the thing on fast enough and they thought the game might have to be canceled. And it stuck with me all these years. And I realized that the people that I like hiring, the people that I like working with, the people that you just like hanging out with are these people I started to call the tarp pullers, the people who were willing to do whatever it takes to get the job done. I'm curious, and you've kind of already kind of flipped some of these assumptions that I have about military life on their head in terms of the chain of command and the communication and the orders. I'm curious, how in an environment like that, how do people work together? How do people collaborate? Everybody has a role, but I would imagine that there's a lot of tarp pulling going on.
Yeah. I mean, you hit it on the head. I think people want to be around gap fillers. They want to be around people that when they see a gap, even though it's outside their scope or their area of responsibility, they see a gap, they address it because they can. And because it's important for the team. That gap filler mentality, everybody pulls the tarp, to me, is what separates individuals and teams. I mean, so in the Army, everybody, regardless of rank, regardless of functional area, regardless, you have to learn basic military skills, life-saving, firing a weapon effectively, maintaining your equipment. You've got to learn this basic amount of basic skills, and everybody's going to count on you to know that, to understand that, because you could be putting them at risk. You could be putting this person, this team at risk. You could put the mission at risk. And when you talk about gap filling, I was in the Army at a senior manager level equivalent, in private sector, we call them senior managers. It'd be like a major in the Army. In every rank in the Army, you've got these key roles that you have to take on, and you got to do well in them. And at the major, it's battalion XO, executive officer, battalion operations officer. And I remember I was part of the 1st Cav division, and I came in at the same time as the new battalion commander. I was going to be his XO. And this guy epitomized, Mark Bellini, he epitomized the gap filler, that everybody pulls the tarp mentality. He was the commander of the logistics battalion that supported all of those forward logistics battalions and supported the whole division. And he employed every resource, every person, every piece of equipment to enable the success of those forward units. I've never, the best example of a gap filler and what you're talking about. And it's important that you experience leaders and people around you that have that mentality, because it rubs off when you see how effective that is and how everybody wants to be on that person's team because they do that. You want to be like that.
Jeff, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's the biggest thing. I think leadership by example, showing people instead of telling people is a really, really powerful thing. And for me, I mean, there's nothing more inspiring, right, than when you see a CEO at the copy machine, or you see a coach pick up a piece of trash. I get messages all the time from people who listen to the show, and it resonates in different ways for people. I got a message from somebody the other day, and they said, when I went out into the working world, this is a relatively young professional. They said, when I went out into my career, my father told me, pick up a piece of trash once in a while around the office. You'll never know, how that might accelerate your career. And she said to me, I just can't help but think of everybody picks up the trash. And I've talked to coaches who put the basketballs on the rack, people who unload luggage from buses when the team is traveling. I asked a guy who had just started on Herm Edwards' staff as an NFL coach. First, he said, Andrew, I didn't call a play. He said, I held the tackling dummies. I cleaned whiteboards. I filled up the water bottles. Somebody, he said to me, somebody told me that just get in and add value. Get in and add value. You say gap filler, right? Just get in and add value. It's remarkable. Time and time again, I hear these stories. And like you said, it's one of these things where you kind of have to see it. But when you see it, it rubs off on you and it impacts you in profound ways. Jeff, I want to start to talk about kind of your life after the military. I mentioned, obviously, you're in a massive role at Stanley Black Decker. You joined Stanley Black Decker in February 2020 to lead global transportation and 3PL warehousing, the director of global logistics at what's got to be, one of the most exciting times in world history for a variety of reasons when it comes to supply chain. And I've told you this story, and it's a little funny anecdote I have, but I was an accounting major at Penn State. My brother was a supply chain major at Penn State, and people always knew what my major was. They didn't necessarily always understand what his major was necessarily. And I knew that his major had made it in the big time when, midway through the pandemic, I get a call from my grandmother, and she says, Andrew, Joe Biden is talking about Phillips major. And that's how I knew that supply chain and logistics was here for the long haul. It had become front and center. It had become mainstream news. So that coincides exactly kind of with your arrival at Stanley Black Decker. So I'm curious, what was that like, kind of jumping into a global supply chain crisis where you needed to lead global logistics?
Yeah, high adventure. It's been high adventure for the last 2+ years. But, there's an old saying in the military, amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. And, even though it's not a hit against my operations teammates, but it just shows you that the complexity of logistics today is, unprecedented. Unprecedented is a word, we've been using a lot in the last couple of years, but it really is. The global supply chains today that are used to being synchronized and stable and predictable, that completely went out the window in February, really the end of January, February, when all the factories overseas went down with COVID. Some came up better. Some companies brought their factories up better than others. Stanley Black Decker did a really great job of bringing its factories overseas up to speed as quickly as possible. But ever since then, it's been an unstable, unpredictable global supply chain. And every day, every week, it's about making it. We had in Stanley Black Decker, and this is leadership. This is leadership from the top. Immediately established 3 priorities for the company, everybody in the company. One was keep yourself, your teammates, and your family safe. 2 is keep the supply chain running, business continuity, keep the supply chain running. And 3 is do your part in the community at the local, state, national, international level to fight COVID. And these 3 priorities are still in place. And, so you talk about communication. That communication came from senior leaders, Stanley Black Decker, right at the beginning. And it really focused everybody. That with daily, really kind of sales and ops meetings, coordination meetings run by the senior vice president of operations that got the whole team together, both on the sales side and on the operations side, and got them all synergized and synced, made adjustments on a daily basis to this very dynamic environment. But we're still facing this today as much as any time in the last 2 years. It's really about visualizing the supply chain and understanding where the points of friction are. where are these points of delay or points of friction? What's the root cause? What are the mitigating actions for addressing them proactively? We can't, we got Shanghai that's been closed down now for a few weeks. I've got one person that reports to me, a senior manager of logistics in Shanghai. She's been on lockdown for 5 weeks. Now, imagine that. I mean, their lockdowns are you stay in the house, you stay in and it's not a house, it's an apartment. Most of the people are, you stay in the apartment. So you have these building lockdowns, you got community lockdowns. But that, it's just one in a series of these VUCA events over the last 2 years. It was already tough trying to deal with factories going down and popping back up, seat pipeline, not, having to refill the seat pipeline. We've got capacity that was brought out of the air freight because passenger travel is no longer going into overseas, especially in China and other places in Asia. But then every so often, we've got these VUCA events popping up. We had the ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. That had a huge impact. We had Yantian port that went down in South China. Huge impact. We've got COVID restrictions right now in Shanghai, which is a lot of companies rely heavily on Shanghai. But it's about it. You talk about communicating. It's about proactive risk identification and mitigation, and it's about trying to drive as much variance out of that end-to-end supply chain as you can on a daily and weekly basis.
Jeff, how is a new leader, to the organization, do you step in during a time of crisis, during a time of massive change and disruption, and set a course for a steady ship?
Well, it allows you to learn the organization pretty quick. It allows you to have an impact pretty quick. And if you got what it takes, you have those right attributes to lead during crisis and to build a team in crisis and to keep the team, motivated and focused on the objectives, it works out well. I mean, you learn quicker, that's for sure.
Jeff, we've got a question in the chat. This will take us back a number of years, but someone is asking at the initial transition from military life to corporate America. What was that like? What were some of the things that you really took with you, and what were some of the things you had to adapt to?
Yeah, so my last assignment in the Army, I was the director of logistics at G4 for a rapid response headquarters in Italy called the Southern European Task Force, airborne, a direct, go jump into, or respond to any emergency that goes on in Europe, basically, or Africa. We transitioned U.S. Army Africa. But right before, when I was getting ready to leave the Army, I was getting ready to retire, I got some really good advice from a retired general that said, because I wanted to break free from the defense. I wanted to break free and go right into civilian non-defense, private sector non-defense. And she said, Jeff, why don't you use the defense industry as a bridge to do that? Because you're familiar with the people, the products, but you're going to be learning from business professionals that are running these defense companies. You'll learn the P&L. You'll learn the business side that you might, didn't have to really focus on while you're in the Army. So that was really great advice. And I'll tell you, I worked for BAE Systems, a great multinational defense company, awesome organization, really solid processes that allowed me to learn things that I hadn't learned in the Army.
What were some of I guess, I don't want to assume that there were challenges. Were there things that were very different that you really needed to kind of work hard to adapt to?
Yeah, I mean, so my first year I went in there as a business development guy. So I had to really learn how to sell logistics services. Before I was leading them. I was an operator. I was a logistics operations professional. Now I had to figure out how to sell logistics services to, different military services. So that takes a special set of attributes too. Not everybody can do that effectively. So I did that for a year and really, so that was kind of there was a learning curve there for me. And then I moved right into being a P&L director in charge of logistics service, multiple logistics service contracts worldwide, one of which was a turnaround activity in Hawaii that the company had to pick up its performance on. So that was a turnaround operation that brought its own unique challenges and really success and sense of achievement.
Jeff, another question here from the live audience in the chat is around, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but it's around kind of the virtual and hybrid work and how that impacts leaders and also team members. And I'm curious to kind of get your take on that. How has that impacted the way you have to lead, the way you organize your teams? And how do you think it also affects the people, in all ranks and levels of the organization?
3 weeks after I started working at Stanley Black Decker, I got to go work from home order from the company. Right. So this was, I think it was March 14th, Friday, March 13th, Saturday, March 14th. So I head back from Baltimore into Detroit, started working from home. And at that time, we didn't use Zoom or Teams or any of these kind of video platforms much. And I thought for sure this was because when we did use them sparingly before, every so often you have these technology glitches that would happen. I'm thinking, how is this going to work with Zoom? And amazing how that technology, talk about how that technology just came online at the right time. Because if it wasn't for Zoom, being able to see people, it's not as effective as being face to face, but it gets close. If you can see people, and as a leader, you can show yourself to your people on a daily basis, meeting after meeting on a daily basis, you can show them you're there, you're right there with them. But and I think the reason why I think it's become so popular or so demanding now is this hybrid work environment is because we've proven how effective it could be. We're no less productive, no less effective. In fact, in some cases, it might be more productive in a remote work environment than we were going into the office. So I think we've demonstrated that there's no drop off in productivity. There is something called Zoom fatigue. Zoom, when you're on camera all the time and you keep doing this, there is that phenomenon going on. But for the most part, I think it's working out. And I think it allows people to adjust within their family environment, especially when you have the kids being schooled from home. And it was completely acceptable. And it still is. A kid running behind somebody that says, hey, wait a minute, I got to go take care of my kid. I'll be right back. That's perfectly fine. It's we've become more of a flexible, agile workforce, I think.
What are some things, just to kind of follow up on that great question from our live audience, and I see a couple more coming in here. Keep the questions coming. We've got a few more minutes with Jeff before we wrap up. Just to follow up on that, I mean, if you were giving advice to anyone at any stage of their career in this virtual or hybrid virtual environment, what's one or two things that they can do to make sure that they continue to develop professionally and get the mentorship that they might otherwise have gotten more naturally in a live in-office environment?
Yeah, I think first is my career advice, wherever you are in your professional life right now, is there's three things really. Seek out the tough jobs, do well in those tough jobs, and be a good teammate. If you do those three things, you can look back at your career at any time and feel satisfied, enriched, and be really proud of yourself. With respect to the, kind of the virtual work environment, to me, there's three lines of action when it comes to professional development. The first line of action is experience you gain from your job. That develops competency and it's part of your professional development. The second line of action in professional development is education certification. And so my recommendation, keep pursuing continued education and certification. In logistics, we've got these APIC certifications. If you're in purchasing, you got other certifications. And quality, you got others. But education certification, that's second line of action. And then the third line of action for professional development would be professional reading and what you're doing, Andrew, in terms of exposing people to this kind of crosstalk and information and insight sharing. You do those, kind of those three things, and you'll continue to develop and be enriched and be satisfied.
Jeff, this event was graciously hosted by the Smeal College of Business. And, as a Smeal College of Business alum, I remember the honor code and how honor and integrity has always been one of the Smeal College of Business and Penn State's strategic pillars. I'm curious, as we just get ready to wrap up here, when you think about the words honor and integrity, what do they mean to you, and how have they shaped your life as a professional?
Yeah, I mean, it's about pride. It's about meeting the expectations of your family, your friends, your coworkers, your leaders. It's about being true to yourself and who you are. I mentioned how, for me at least, the Catholic education built a conscience. The integrity part of it, do the right thing. One of my first guiding principle is do the right thing. just do the right thing. Well, what is the right thing? I mean, if you're not grounded, if you don't have that foundation of values, what is the right thing? It's clear. It's clear to me what the right thing is, but that's important. So honor and integrity, both of them, Army values, right, is that we got measured on a daily basis. So very important.
Jeff, there is no question that you have lived your life with honor, integrity, and that, as I like to say, you are a tarp puller, 100%. You are a tarp puller, Jeff. I appreciate you spending some time with me and giving me the opportunity to ask you some questions, learn from you, and all of us participating live today and listening to Everybody Pulls the Tarp on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever the podcast is being streamed, the opportunity to tap into your experiences, tap into your wisdom, both serving in the U.S. military and in various different industries. And today, for Stanley Black Decker, the Fortune 500 iconic brand. Like I said, Jeff, you are truly a tarp puller, no question. Thank you for your service. Thank you for spending some time with me. Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can catch all of our upcoming episodes. And if you are like me and want a world full of tarp pullers, then leave a review to help others find us. You can also follow me on Twitter at Andrew H. Moses. That's Andrew H. Moses. And be sure to sign up for my email newsletter at everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter. I'll share tips and insights to help you achieve maximum success and happiness. Today is a great day to pull the tarp. I am rooting for you. See you next time.